The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which Elena Vasquez would later remember as the kind of day that feels ordinary right up until the moment it isn't. She had been standing at the kitchen sink, rinsing the same coffee mug she had rinsed every morning for the past 11 years, watching the water circle the drain in that mindless, meditative way that had become her substitute for actual peace. The boys were already at school. The dishes from the night before sat in a drying rack she had never gotten around to putting away. Outside, the sky over the apartment complex was the flat gray of a wrung-out cloth, the kind of sky that promised nothing and delivered exactly that. She had not expected any mail that mattered. The things that arrived in her mailbox these days were statements, overdue notices dressed in formal language, saw coupons for grocery stores she could no longer afford to shop at, and the occasional flyer for a local realtor who apparently believed that everyone in the building was one signature away from upgrading their life. So when she pulled the slim envelope from the box and saw the return address of a law firm she did not recognize, she almost didn't open it. Almost. The letter was brief. Her Great-Aunt Cecilia, a woman Elena had met exactly twice in her life, had died at the age of 89 in a coastal town 5 hours south of where Elena stood in her robe and slippers. Cecilia had left no children, no surviving spouse, and no close relatives other than Elena herself, who was, according to the letter, the sole beneficiary of the estate. The lawyer's name was Daniel Okafor, and he had left a phone number she could call to discuss the details of the inheritance. Elena set the letter on the counter and stared at it. She did not feel excitement. She felt something closer to suspicion, the guarded reaction of a woman who had been disappointed enough times to know that good news usually came with a hidden cost. She made herself another cup of coffee, sat down at the kitchen table, and read the letter again. Then she called the number. Daniel Okafor had a voice like warm stone, unhurried and solid, and he seemed to understand, without being told that Elena was a person who would need things explained carefully. He told her that Cecilia had owned a piece of coastal land, several acres of clifftop terrain on the southern edge of a small harbor town. The land itself had no house on it, no structure of any value. The cliffs rose steeply from the water, covered in scrub brush and seagrass, accessible only by a narrow gravel path that wound down from the road above. The previous assessment of the property had placed its value at just under $18,000, and that, Daniel said carefully, was the generous estimate. Elena asked if there was anything else, any money, any savings, any other assets. Daniel paused in the way that lawyers pause when the answer is no, but they didn't want to be the one to say it first. There was a small checking account, he said finally, with $412 in it. That was everything. She thanked him, hung up, and sat for a long time listening to the refrigerator hum. In the days that followed, Elena told herself she would deal with it practically. So she would contact a local real estate agent in the harbor town, list the cliffs for whatever she could get, take the money, and use it to pay down the medical debt that had been accumulating since her younger son Matteo's hospitalization 2 years prior. It was not a windfall. It was barely a footnote. But $18,000, even after taxes and legal fees, was more than she had seen in a single transaction in a very long time. She did not rush. She could not afford the gas to drive 5 hours on a hope, so she sent a few emails, made a few phone calls, and waited to hear back from agents in the area. The first one who responded did so within a day, and his reply carried an almost audible wince. He knew the property, he said. Everyone in the area knew it. The cliffs had been on the market twice before and had failed to sell either time. The terrain was too unstable for development permits, too remote for residential buyers, and too visually dramatic to be useful to anyone other than a painter or a fool. The scrub vegetation had made even basic maintenance a challenge. The access road flooded every winter, and the caves below, the network of sea caves that cut through the base of the cliffs from the shoreline, had been officially designated as environmentally sensitive, which meant that any activity within them was subject to layers of regulatory approval that most developers would never bother to pursue. Elena read his email twice, absorbing each discouragement the way she had learned to absorb most bad news, without dramatics, and with the flat patience of someone who had stopped being surprised. She thanked him and asked if he would list it anyway. He said he would, though his tone suggested he was doing her a courtesy rather than a service. The response from her family was worse. She had called her cousin Marisol first, mostly because Marisol was the one person in the family she still talked to regularly, the one who called on birthdays and remembered the boys' names without prompting. Marisol had listened to the story with the attentive silence of someone waiting for the part where it gets good, and when the story ended with sea caves and an $18,000 cliffside, her silence shifted into something more awkward. "That's it?" Marisol said. "That's it," Elena said. "Soy Elena." Marisol's voice softened with the particular tenderness reserved for breaking bad news. "Honey, you can't afford to get attached to this. Sell whatever you can and move on. Don't let this become a project." "It's not a project," Elena said. "I'm trying to sell it." "Good," Marisol said. "That's good. Because you know how these things go. Old properties, weird terrain, legal restrictions. You spend more trying to figure it out than you ever get back." It was practical advice. It was the kind of advice any reasonable person would have given, and Elena knew it. But something snagged inside her, something small and stubborn, when Marisol said the word restricted. She didn't know why. She filed it away without examining it and went on with her week. The second agent she contacted was even blunter. He told her the cliffs were a liability, not an asset. The coastal erosion in the area had accelerated over the past decade, and there were several local cases of clifftop parcels being condemned outright after significant land movement. He recommended she contact the county assessor before spending a single dollar on the property, because there was a non-trivial chance the land would be reclassified in a way that eliminated even the nominal value it currently held. He was not unkind about it. He was simply honest, in the way that people are honest when they have nothing to gain by softening the truth. Elena's brother, when she finally told him, laughed. Not cruelly, not with malice, but with the kind of helpless laughter that comes from recognition. Hector was 3 years older, more practical by nature, and had always been the one who cut through her optimism with his particular brand of blunt affection. He laughed and then said, Of course old Cecilia left you cliffs. What else would it be? She was eccentric her whole life. The woman kept goats in her kitchen." He said this with great fondness, and also with absolute certainty that the inheritance was worthless. Sell it, Elena. Take whatever you can get, and be grateful you didn't inherit the goats. The real estate listing went up on a Thursday. By Friday evening, it had received 11 views and 0 inquiries. Elena kept the browser tab open on her phone. She checked it the way people check things they already know the answer to, compulsively, without hope, for the faint satisfaction of being confirmed. The days passed. The tab showed the same number. The listing sat in the database like a stone at the bottom of a pond, visible only to those who looked carefully and of interest to no one. It was on a Sunday afternoon, 2 weeks after the listing went live, that Elena made the decision she could not fully explain afterward. She packed a bag, arranged for her neighbor Mrs. Okonkwo to check on the boys after school, kissed both of them on the foreheads with the specific tenderness of a mother who does not know how long she will be gone, and drove 5 hours south. She told herself she was going to see the property before signing any paperwork, that it was simply due diligence, the responsible thing. But somewhere around the 3rd hour of driving, with the landscape shifting from highway concrete to coastal scrub and the air beginning to carry the first trace of salt, she admitted to herself that there was another reason. She needed to see it with her own eyes, not because she expected anything, but because it was hers. The only thing in her life that was entirely, unconditionally, unencumberedly hers, and she had never once in her adult life owned anything that matched that description. The harbor town was smaller than she had imagined, the kind of place that survives on fishing revenue and weekend tourists, with a main street that had 3 coffee shops and a hardware store and very little else. She stopped at the coffee shop nearest the waterfront, bought a black coffee she could barely afford, and unfolded the property map the lawyer had mailed her. The cliffs were at the southern end of the harbor, past the last of the boat docks, past a small nature reserve marker, so accessible by the gravel road the agent had mentioned. She drove there as the sun started its afternoon descent, parking on the shoulder where the gravel path began and stepping out into wind that hit her immediately and continuously. The kind of coastal wind that does not gust so much as press, steady and relentless against her jacket. The path was narrow, edged on one side by low scrub and on the other by open air. She walked it carefully, feeling the ground firm and packed beneath her feet, despite the previous warnings about erosion. And then she saw it. The cliffs opened before her at the end of the path in a way that photographs cannot prepare a person for. They rose from the sea in great dark shelves of basalt, their faces streaked with white mineral deposits and the rust-colored stain of oxidized iron. Below them, the water moved in long, rolling heaves that broke against the rock with a sound like something enormous breathing. The seagrass on the clifftop bent constantly in the wind, silvery and fluid, and the sky above was enormous, the open sky of a place where nothing interrupts the horizon. Elena stood at the edge of the path and felt something shift inside her. She could not name it precisely. It was not joy, not yet, and not hope in any specific sense. It was something older and quieter, the feeling of a landscape that has not been diminished by human use, that exists on its own terms, indifferent and magnificent. She stood there for a long time, long enough for the wind to work its way through her jacket, long enough for the light to change and the water to darken. And she thought about Cecilia, whom she had met twice and barely known. And she wondered what the old woman had seen in this place that made her hold it for all those years, without selling, without building, without doing anything with it at all. She stayed until the light was almost gone. Then she drove back to town, found the cheapest motel, and lay awake in the dark, listening to the distant sound of the ocean and thinking about nothing she could articulate. In the morning, she drove back to the cliffs. She had brought better shoes this time, and a flashlight, though she had not consciously planned to need either. She told herself she was simply going to look around more carefully before finalizing her decision about the listing. She told herself this was still just practical. The path down to the shoreline was steeper than she'd anticipated, so it cut into the cliff face in irregular steps that someone had carved long ago and never properly finished. She descended slowly, one hand against the rock face, feeling the temperature drop as she moved down from the wind-swept top into the sheltered base. The sound of the water intensified as she went lower, filling the air in a way that made it hard to think in straight lines. At the bottom, a narrow strip of tumbled stone ran along the cliff base, wide enough in places to walk comfortably, narrow in others to barely a foot's breadth. The sea beyond the rocks was calmer here, sheltered by the cliff's geometry, and she could see into the water with a clarity that surprised her. It was very deep, very blue, and very still beneath the surface churn. She walked along the base of the cliff, picking her way over the stones, and that was when she saw the first opening. It was not dramatic. It was simply a gap in the rock face, perhaps 4 feet wide and 6 feet tall, shaped like a rough arch, where the stone had fractured and separated over some long-ago geological event. The interior was dark beyond the first few feet, but she could see that the cave extended inward. The floor was stone, wet and smoothed by water. The walls rose in uneven shelves. There was no smell of rot or stagnation. The air that came from inside was cold and faintly mineral, the clean cold of deep rock. She stood at the entrance for a long time before she went in. The flashlight showed her a passage that narrowed, then widened, then narrowed again, the walls pressing close and then retreating in the arbitrary geometry of rock, carved by water over millennia. The floor rose slightly as she went deeper, moving away from the tide line, and the sound of the sea diminished behind her into a low, resonant hum. She had expected to feel afraid. She had expected the instinctive animal caution of a person entering an enclosed and unfamiliar space. Instead, she felt something else, the sensation of entering a room that has been waiting. She stopped when the passage widened into a space large enough to stand in with both arms extended, without touching the walls. Her flashlight swept across the ceiling, which rose in a dome-like vault, and across the floor, which was covered in the same smoothed stone as the passage. The cave was perhaps 30 feet across at its widest point, tapering toward the back where another passage continued deeper into the cliff. She stood in the center of the space and turned slowly, letting the light fall across every surface. It was in that slow turning that she noticed it. Not treasure, not immediately, but something that made her pause and lean closer, something that didn't belong to the natural geometry of the cave. Along the left wall, roughly at shoulder height, there was a section of stone that was different in texture from the rest. It was smoother, more regular, fitted in a way that the natural wall wasn't. She moved toward it, the flashlight pointed directly at the surface, and saw what looked like the edge of a seam, a straight vertical line where two surfaces met in a join too precise to be natural. Her pulse quickened. She pressed her fingers against the surface and felt it. Cool stone, yes, but with the faint giveaway of human construction beneath the moss and mineral deposit that had accumulated on its face. Someone had built something into this wall, not recently, not within any time frame she could place at a glance, but built deliberately, with intent, and with sufficient care, that decades of tidal air and mineral wash had only partially obscured it. She stood in that cave, in that darkness, broken only by the narrow beam of her flashlight, and felt the entire shape of her life rearrange itself around that moment. She did not touch it further. Not that day. She climbed back up the cliff path as the wind pushed at her back, and she drove to the nearest diner, ordered eggs she barely tasted, and called Daniel Okafor. "Is there anything in the property records about the cave system?" she asked. Daniel was quiet for a moment. "Well, there is a notation," he said. "Your great-aunt submitted a permit inquiry to the county environmental office about 12 years ago. There's no record of a permit being issued, and there's a separate notation from 30 years before that, when Cecilia first acquired the land. A geological survey was conducted at her request. The survey mentions the existence of sea caves at the base of the cliffs, but classifies them as environmentally sensitive due to the marine ecosystem present in the tidal zones." "Did the survey go into the caves?" Elena asked. "It assessed the tidal zones only," Daniel said. "The interior passages were noted as present, but not explored." She thanked him and hung up. She stared at her eggs. Cecilia had requested a permit 12 years ago. For what? The record didn't say. And 30 years before that, she had commissioned a geological survey that mentioned the caves without entering them. A woman who kept goats in her kitchen and held on to a worthless piece of clifftop land for decades. A woman who had apparently never told anyone what she thought the land was worth. Elena left enough cash for the bill and went back to the motel. That night, she did something she had not done in years. She stayed awake not from worry or anxiety or the grinding arithmetic of debt, but from a feeling she had nearly forgotten how to recognize. She stayed awake because her mind was moving, because something in her had caught hold of a thread and would not let go, because the sealed seam in the cave wall had planted something in her that was germinating with the particular urgency of a seed left too long in dry ground and finally given water. She did not sleep until almost 4 in the morning. In the following days, she rearranged her return. She had told Mrs. Okonkwo she might be gone a few days. She called now and asked for a week. Mrs. Okonkwo, who had raised 6 children of her own and understood the particular desperation of single mothers chasing unlikely things, said of course without asking questions. Elena called the boys each evening and heard in their voices the easy resilience of children who trust that their mother will return, and she held that trust like a coal in her hands, warm and requiring careful handling. She went back to the caves every day. She went carefully, with better equipment each time, a brighter flashlight, a notebook, rubber-soled boots she found at a second-hand shop in town for $9. She mapped the passages as best she could, then sketching rough diagrams in her notebook, noting where the floor rose and fell, where passages branched, where the ceiling dropped, and where it vaulted upward. The cave system was more extensive than she had first understood. What had looked from the entrance like a single passage and one main chamber was in fact a branching network that extended deeper into the cliff than she could explore in a single visit. She was careful about the tides. She had downloaded a local tide table on her phone and studied it each morning before descending. She kept track of the time obsessively. She had no intention of being caught in a rising tide in a cave system she was still mapping. The risks were real, and she was not reckless by nature. But she was also not the woman who had stood at a kitchen sink 11 days ago, watching water circle a drain with the dull resignation of someone waiting for her life to stop happening to her. On the 5th day, she found the second chamber. She had followed a passage that angled upward from the main cave floor, rising steeply enough that she had to use her hands against the walls for balance. It was drier up here, above the reach of even the highest tides, and the air had changed from the cold, mineral clarity of the lower passages to something slightly warmer, still and held. The passage opened without warning into a chamber perhaps twice the size of the first one, its ceiling high enough to be lost in shadow above the flashlight beam. The walls of this chamber were different. She swept the light slowly across them, and her breath stopped in her throat. The irregularities she had noticed in the first chamber, the seams, the too smooth surfaces, were here also, but more numerous, more obvious, and accompanied by something else. In the lower section of the far wall, half obscured by a thick mineral deposit of pale calcite that had built up over what must have been a very long time, there were shapes she recognized, regular shapes, rectangular, uniform, stacked, not natural formations, not any geological accident she could account for. She crossed the chamber slowly, her footsteps loud in the silence, and knelt before the far wall. She reached out and pressed her palm flat against the calcite deposit. Beneath it, beneath decades of mineral accumulation, the shapes she had seen were solid. They were hard-edged. They were real. She sat back on her heels in the silent chamber, deep inside the cliff that everyone had told her was worthless, and understood, with a clarity that felt almost quiet, almost gentle, that the world she had inhabited for the past several years was about to become entirely different. She did not call anyone that night. She went back to the motel, sat on the edge of the bed, and held her own hands in her lap, feeling them shake. There were things she needed to do next, and she needed to do them in the right order, and she needed to do them carefully, and she could not afford to do any of them wrong. She had boys at home. She had debt. She had a life that had been assembled from the available materials under difficult conditions, and it was not a life she could risk on a feeling, no matter how certain that feeling was. She needed evidence. She needed expertise. She needed someone who could tell her what she had found, and whether it was what she thought it was. She needed to be calm. She pressed her hands flat on her thighs and breathed slowly, in and out, the way she had learned to breathe in the years when panic had been her constant companion, the years after Marco left and the bills started, and the boys were too young to understand why their mother sometimes cried in the bathroom with the fan on. She had learned to be steady then, because there was no alternative. She called on that steadiness now. In the morning, she drove to the library. The harbor town's library was the kind of institution that small coastal towns support through bake sales and volunteer labor, unstaffed by a single librarian named June, who appeared to be in her late 70s and regarded every patron with the specific warmth of someone who has spent decades believing that information is the most generous thing one human being can offer another. Elena asked about local history. June's eyes brightened. The town had been a working harbor since the mid-1800s, June explained. Before the advent of modern shipping routes, it had been a significant stopover point for coastal trade, particularly for vessels moving goods between major ports along the southern coast. At its peak, in the latter half of the 19th century, the harbor had been a place of considerable commercial activity, with warehouses, trading firms, and the associated infrastructure of a working maritime economy. And then, as was the way with small harbors, when the economics of shipping shifted, it had declined. The warehouses emptied, the trading firms closed or relocated. The town contracted into what it was now, a place of modest beauty and modest means, remembered mostly by the people who had chosen to stay. Elena asked about the cliffs specifically. June tilted her head. The southern cliffs, she said, had once been used, she believed, for storage. The caves at their base had been known to the trading community for generations. She had a vague recollection of reading something about it, somewhere, years ago. She excused herself and disappeared into the back for 15 minutes, emerging with a folder of photocopied documents, the pages of a local historical society newsletter from 1987. Elena sat at the library table and read. The newsletter was written in the fond, slightly breathless style of amateur local historians, full of italicized phrases and exclamation points. But beneath the enthusiasm, there was information. The article, written by a man named Arthur Reyes, who had apparently spent 2 decades documenting the harbor's commercial history, described the southern cliff caves as having been used extensively in the 1880s and 1890s as emergency storage for high-value cargo. The caves, he wrote, were ideal for the purpose because of their location above the tidal line in the upper passages, their naturally stable temperature, and their remoteness from the main harbor, where theft was a constant concern. The article listed several of the goods that had reportedly been stored there over the years: spices, bolts of imported fabric, wine, and, on at least 2 documented occasions, gold. Elena read that sentence again. Gold. Specifically, Arthur Reyes wrote, gold bullion being transported on behalf of a now-defunct trading consortium, which had used the southern caves as a temporary holding facility during a period when the harbor's main warehouses were overcrowded during peak trading season. The bullion had been stored on 2 separate occasions, both in the early 1890s. Both times, it had been retrieved without incident. But the article ended with a note that made Elena's hands go very still on the page. There was, Arthur Reyes wrote, a persistent local account of a 3rd shipment, larger than the previous 2, transported during a period of extreme weather that had disrupted harbor operations in the winter of 1893. According to oral accounts collected from several elderly residents in the 1970s, the 3rd shipment had arrived at the southern caves, but had never been retrieved. The trading consortium had dissolved in 1894 following the death of its primary operator and a series of legal disputes among his heirs. Several attempts had reportedly been made to locate the cached goods in the years immediately following, but the accounts were inconsistent and contradictory, and no recovery had ever been documented. Arthur Reyes concluded by saying that the story was, in all likelihood, the kind of legend that accumulates around any place with a history of commerce and concealment. He did not believe the gold had ever existed in the quantity described, but he thought it was a fine story. Elena set the newsletter down on the library table. She sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the wall of the library, which was hung with a nautical chart of the harbor and a hand-painted sign that read, "Knowledge is the anchor." She thought about Cecilia, who had acquired this land decades ago, who had commissioned a geological survey of the caves, who had applied for a permit 12 years ago and received no answer, who had never sold the land, who had held onto a patch of cliff and seagrass for her entire adult life, long past any reasonable expectation of return, with the patient, relentless conviction of someone who was waiting for the right moment. Elena thought about what it means to know something that no one else will believe. She gathered her things, thanked June, and walked out into the salt wind. She had work to do. She called a geologist first, not a local one. She drove back to the motel and spent 2 hours on her phone searching for someone with expertise in coastal cave systems and geological survey, someone who could come on short notice and who charged rates she might be able to negotiate. She found a woman named Dr. Patricia Solano, a retired geological consultant who had spent 30 years working for mining companies and now did private assessments. Elena explained the situation carefully, leaving out her own conclusions and presenting only the facts as she knew them. Dr. Solano listened without interrupting and asked 3 precise questions, the kind of questions that told Elena she was talking to someone who understood what she was describing. Dr. Solano could come in 2 weeks. Her preliminary assessment would cost $800. Elena did not have $800. She called her bank, asked about a personal loan against her car, and was told she could have $1,200 within 3 business days. She said yes. That night she called Marisol. "I need another week," Elena said. Marisol sighed. "Elena, the boys need their mother." "The boys are fine with Mrs. Okonkwo. I checked on them today. Matteo is teaching Luke how to play chess." "What are you doing down there?" Elena paused. She thought about the chamber, about the calcite-coated shapes in the far wall, about Cecilia's permit application, and Arthur Reyes, and the winter of 1893. She thought about how the story would sound to Marisol, who was practical and loving, and who had told her not to get attached. "I'm doing my due diligence," Elena said. "I'm making sure I understand what I have before I decide what to do with it." Marisol's silence carried the specific texture of someone who suspects she is not being given the full story. "Is everything okay?" "Yes," Elena said. And then, more quietly, "I think so." After she hung up, she sat outside the motel room on the concrete step in the dark, listening to the distant ocean, and let herself feel, just for a moment, the full weight and wonder of what she thought she had found. She let herself feel the terror of it, too, because she was a woman who had been disappointed before, who had believed in things that turned out to be smaller than they appeared, who had built hope on insufficient evidence and paid for it in ways she would not describe to anyone. But this was different. She could feel that it was different. Not because she was lucky, not because the universe owed her anything, but because of Cecilia, who had known, and because of Arthur Reyes, who had found the story, and because of the hard-edged rectangular shapes beneath the calcite on the far wall of the upper chamber. Shapes that no geological process had ever produced. She went inside, brushed her teeth, set her alarm, and slept the deep sleep of someone who has found their direction. In the 2 weeks before Dr. Solano arrived, Elena did not go back into the caves. She made this decision deliberately, with difficulty. She wanted to go back every day. She wanted to press her hands against the calcite wall and listen for something. Instead, she drove home, collected the boys, brought them with her back to the harbor town, enrolled them temporarily in the local school with a note explaining a family situation, and settled into a weekly rental of a small cottage 2 miles from the cliffs that cost less than the motel had. She established a routine. She got the boys to school each morning. She researched, in the library and online, everything she could find about the trading consortium Arthur Reyes had mentioned, about coastal storage practices in the 1890s, about maritime salvage law and property rights, and the legal status of objects found within land you own. She read everything she could find about the geological history of the coastline. She contacted the county environmental office and inquired, carefully and without specifics, about the process for conducting a formal assessment of a coastal cave system on private property. She did not tell anyone in the harbor town what she thought she had found. This was harder than it sounds in a town of that size. The motel owner, the librarian June, the woman at the diner where she ate breakfast twice a week. They were all curious about the woman from the city who had inherited the southern cliffs and was still here a month after the inheritance. Elena answered their questions pleasantly and without information. She said she was thinking about what to do with the land. She said she was taking her time. She said that old properties required patience. They seemed to accept this. Coastal people understood patience. Hector called on a Wednesday. "Marisol says you're still down there," he said. "She's worried." "Tell Marisol I'm fine." "What are you doing, Elena?" "I told you, on due diligence, on $18,000 of cliff." He said it without cruelty, with the exasperation of a brother who loves his sister and cannot understand her. "Elena, come home. Sell the land to whoever will take it and come home." "I will," she said, "when I'm ready." There was a pause. "Is something going on that you're not telling me?" She thought about all the ways she could answer that, all the careful, hedging, protective words she could use to keep him from worrying while keeping the truth close to her chest, where she could tend it without interference. "No," she said. "Everything is fine." He did not believe her. She could hear it in the silence before he said goodbye. But he also did not push, because Hector, for all his bluntness, knew when his sister had made up her mind. Dr. Patricia Solano arrived on a Friday morning in a truck that had seen better decades, wearing boots that had clearly been to places a flashlight couldn't fully illuminate, and carrying equipment in cases that Elena recognized as the kind of equipment that asked serious questions of the earth. She was 63, small-boned, with white hair cut close to her head, and the economical manner of someone who has spent a lifetime working in places where unnecessary words were a luxury. They drove to the cliffs together. Elena showed her the path. Dr. Solano descended without comment, studying the cliff face and the cave entrance with a professional attention that was, Elena found, both reassuring and slightly terrifying. Inside the first chamber, Dr. Solano ran her hands along the sealed section of wall Elena had noticed. I tapped it with a small geological hammer, listened to the sound it produced, and nodded once, a single contained nod that told Elena nothing and everything. In the upper chamber, Dr. Solano knelt before the far wall for a very long time. She ran measurements. She photographed the calcite deposits and the shapes beneath them. She used a device Elena didn't recognize to take readings from the wall surface. She made notes in a small book with the concentrated attention of a person solving a problem they have seen before, or something very close to something they have seen before. Elena stood to one side and said nothing. The boys were in school. The wind outside was audible through the passages as a low, intermittent murmur. The chamber was very quiet. Finally, Dr. Solano stood up and turned around. She looked at Elena for a long moment, with the expression of a person calibrating how much to say. "The calcite deposit on this section of the wall," she said, "is consistent with a formation period of approximately 100 to 130 years." She paused. "Which means whatever is behind it was placed there in roughly that same period." Elena said nothing. "The shapes," Dr. Solano continued, "are regular, uniform, consistent with stacked rectangular objects of significant density. The acoustic readings from the wall suggest a substantial void behind the surface layer, and within that void, material that is producing a density signature I would expect from metal." She paused again. "Heavy metal. In quantity." The cave held the silence between them. "How much quantity?" Elena asked. Dr. Solano looked at her. "Well, that," she said, "is a question for a different kind of expert." The drive back from the cliffs that afternoon was the longest 20 minutes of Elena Vasquez's life. Dr. Solano sat in the passenger seat with her notebook open on her knee, making additional notations in her small, compressed handwriting, and Elena drove with both hands on the wheel and her eyes on the road, and her mind somewhere entirely else. The boys would be getting out of school in an hour. She needed to think about dinner. She needed to think about the laundry she had left soaking in the cottage sink that morning. She needed to think about ordinary things, because if she allowed herself to think about what Dr. Solano had just told her, she was not confident she could keep the truck between the lane markings. Heavy metal. In quantity. She parked in front of the cottage and sat for a moment after Dr. Solano climbed out, her hand still on the wheel, engine ticking as it cooled. Through the windshield, the afternoon light fell across the scrub grass in long amber bars, and the sound of the ocean was everywhere, pervasive, oceanic in the way that becomes background, only after you have been somewhere long enough for your nervous system to accept it as a given. She got out of the truck. Inside, Dr. Solano set her cases on the kitchen table and opened them with the systematic efficiency of someone who keeps their equipment in order as a matter of professional self-respect. She laid out her notes, her photographs, her device readings, and organized them into a sequence that Elena could follow. Then she sat down across from Elena and folded her hands on the table and spoke with the directness of a woman who has spent her career translating the language of the earth into information that human beings can use. The calcite formation, she explained, was a secondary mineral deposit produced by the slow leaching of calcium carbonate through the cave walls over time. It was, in essence, a natural clock. The thickness and density of the deposit on the far wall of the upper chamber was consistent with approximately a century of undisturbed accumulation. This meant that whatever lay behind the deposit had been placed there, and then left entirely undisturbed, for somewhere between 90 and 130 years. The deposit had formed over and around the objects the way coral forms over a submerged structure, or encasing them in layers of white mineral that had, over time, made them look like part of the natural wall. Elena asked how she could be certain the shapes were not natural formations. Dr. Solano looked at her with the patient expression of someone who has been asked the right question. She explained that calcium carbonate formations in cave systems, stalactites, stalagmites, flowstone, all of them followed the physics of dripping water and gravity. They were characteristically tapered, rounded, asymmetrical, driven by the particular path that water took through the specific geology of a specific place. What she had found in the upper chamber of the southern cliffs was none of those things. The shapes were rectilinear. They had consistent dimensions across their visible surface area, and they were stacked in a configuration that no natural process had ever produced. They were, in her professional judgment, objects, manufactured objects, objects placed there by human hands. Elena asked about the density reading. Dr. Solano opened her notebook to a specific page and turned it to face Elena across the table. The numbers were meaningless to Elena in their raw form, but Dr. Solano walked her through them. The device she had used measured acoustic resonance, essentially listening to what the wall said when struck at a specific frequency. Dense materials returned a particular kind of response. Hollow spaces returned another. The readings from the far wall of the upper chamber were consistent with a void containing material of high density, higher than stone, higher than wood, one higher than any organic matter that might have been stored in a coastal cave in the 1890s. The density profile was consistent with metallic objects, specifically with dense metallic objects stacked in a regular pattern in a contained space. She could not, she said, tell Elena with certainty what the metal was. That required direct access, which required removing the calcite deposit, which required both proper equipment and the relevant permits. What she could tell Elena, with the confidence of 30 years of reading geological evidence, was that there was something behind that wall. Something substantial. Something that had been put there by a person or persons who understood that this particular cave, at this particular elevation, above the tidal reach, with its naturally stable temperature and its remote location and its geological stability, was as good a long-term storage facility as the 19th century had to offer. She closed the notebook. She told Elena she would write a formal report of her findings, which Elena could use for whatever purposes she deemed appropriate. She did not ask what those purposes were. She did not offer opinions about what Elena should do next. She simply said that, in her professional opinion, this finding warranted further investigation by qualified specialists, and that Elena should move carefully and methodically, and, above all, quietly. Quietly, Elena repeated. The moment other people know what might be in those caves, Dr. Solano said, looking at her steadily, the situation becomes complicated in ways that are difficult to predict and more difficult to control. Elena understood. She paid Dr. Solano in cash from the loan she had taken against her car. Dr. Solano wrote her a receipt, packed her cases, and drove away in her battle-worn truck without ceremony. Elena stood in the cottage doorway watching the truck disappear down the road, and then she went inside to start dinner. She made pasta because pasta was cheap, and because both boys would eat it without argument. She listened to Matteo describe a disagreement he had with a classmate about the rules of a game she didn't understand. And she listened to Luke, who was 8, and still at the age when everything that had happened at school was equally urgent and equally worth reporting, describe a caterpillar he had found on the playground. She laughed in the right places and asked the right questions and braided her fingers together under the table, where neither of them could see them shaking. After they were in bed, she sat at the kitchen table with Dr. Solano's preliminary notes, which the geologist had left with her, and with her own notebook in which she had been compiling research for the past 2 weeks. She spread everything across the table and looked at it as a whole. The picture that emerged was not a guarantee. It was not a certainty. But it was a coherent story, and coherent stories, in Elena's experience, tended to point somewhere real. A trading consortium in the 1890s, a harbor busy enough to require overflow storage, a winter of bad weather in 1893 that disrupted normal operations, a third shipment, larger than the previous 2, he moved to the southern caves for safekeeping, the dissolution of the consortium in 1894, no documented recovery, an old woman who had acquired this particular piece of clifftop land and held it, without selling, for decades. A geological survey commissioned, but never fully followed up. A permit application 12 years ago that had gone nowhere. Cecilia had known. Elena was certain of it. or if not known with certainty, then suspected with enough conviction to make a lifetime's worth of decisions around the suspicion. The old woman had held the land the way you hold a secret, not because you know exactly what to do with it, but because you know enough not to let it go. Elena turned to a clean page in her notebook and wrote a list. The list had 4 items on it. The first was a maritime historian, and someone who could verify and expand on what Arthur Reyes had written in the local historical society newsletter. Someone who could tell her whether the account of the 1893 shipment was documented anywhere beyond the oral histories Reyes had collected. The second was a maritime lawyer, someone who could explain clearly what her legal rights were with respect to objects found within the boundaries of her own property. The third was a conservation specialist who could advise on the environmental permits required to access the upper caves without triggering regulatory complications. And the fourth was an appraiser, a specific kind of appraiser, the kind who knew what gold bullion from the 1890s was worth. She looked at the list for a long time. Then she added a 5th item. Tell no one. She underlined it twice. In the weeks that followed, Elena worked through the list with the methodical patience of someone who has learned that rushing is the enemy of everything. She found the maritime historian through the university library system, a woman named Dr. Frances Alderton, who had written 2 books on Pacific coastal trade in the 19th century, and who, when Elena described what she was researching, became very quiet and then very precise in her questions. Elena was careful with what she shared. She described the Arthur Reyes account, the permit application, the geological survey. She did not describe what Dr. Solano had found in the upper chamber. She simply asked whether the account of the 1893 shipment had any documentary basis beyond oral history. Dr. Alderton called her back 3 days later. She had found 2 things. The first was a shipping manifest from the harbor's master registry for 1893, partially damaged by water, but legible, which listed a significant incoming cargo from a southern port under the name of the trading consortium Arthur Reyes had mentioned. The cargo was described in the manifest as agricultural goods, but Dr. Alderton, who had spent decades reading the euphemisms of 19th century commercial documentation, said that this particular consortium had used that designation consistently to describe precious metal shipments, a practice common among trading firms that wish to avoid drawing attention at customs. The manifest listed the cargo as received, but contained no corresponding outgoing record for that shipment. It had arrived. There was no documentation of it leaving. The second thing, Doctor, what Alderton found was a legal filing from 1895. One of the heirs of the consortium's primary operator had filed a complaint with the county court, alleging that a significant portion of the consortium's assets had been lost or concealed during the dissolution. The complaint named a specific sum. The filing was incomplete. The case had apparently been dropped or abandoned, but the number was there, in faded legal ink, a century and a quarter old. Dr. Alderton read the number to Elena over the phone. Elena wrote it in her notebook and stared at it. The number represented, in the currency of 1895, a sum that would have been considered extraordinary. Dr. Alderton, anticipating the question Elena hadn't asked yet, said she had done a rough calculation of what that quantity of gold bullion would be worth at current market prices, but accounting for the likely purity of commercial-grade gold in that era and the weight implied by the documentary record. The number she gave Elena was not $18,000. It was not $100,000. It was not $1 million. Elena sat very still in the cottage kitchen with the phone pressed against her ear and looked at the number she had written in her notebook. She looked at it for a long time. The ocean sound came through the windows, steady and enormous, indifferent as ever to the scale of human events. She thanked Dr. Alderton. She said she would be in touch. She set her phone on the table and looked at the number. $305 million. That was the rough estimate. That was what the quantity of gold described in the 1895 legal filing, if it was still there, and if it was what the density reading suggested, if the account was accurate, and the recovery had never happened, would be worth at current market value. Dr. Alderton had given her a range. The lower end was $280 million. The upper end exceeded $320. The midpoint, accounting for all variables, was $305. Elena picked up her pen. She drew a line through the number she had written. Then she wrote it again, more carefully, as though putting it on paper correctly would make it more real or less terrifying. She sat with it for an hour before she allowed herself to move. The maritime lawyer she found through a referral from Daniel Okafor, who, when Elena called to ask if he knew anyone specializing in maritime property law, he paused for a moment in the way that lawyers pause when they sense they are missing something important, and then gave her a name without pressing her for details. The lawyer's name was Marcus Chen, and he practiced from an office 2 hours away, and he had a voice on the phone that reminded Elena of Daniel Okafor's, unhurried and solid. The voice of someone who has seen enough surprising things that very little surprises them anymore. She drove to his office on a Thursday, having arranged for the boys to go home with a classmate after school. She sat across the desk from Marcus Chen and told him everything. Not almost everything. Everything. She told him about the caves, about Dr. Solano, about the calcite deposit and the density readings, about Arthur Reyes and Dr. Alderton and the 1895 legal filing and the number that was written in her notebook. She spread the documents across his desk in the order she had organized them and watched him read. He read carefully and without reaction. When he finished, he stacked the papers neatly and set them aside and looked at her. He told her several things, and he told them to her in plain language. First, objects found within the boundaries of privately owned land, including subsurface objects and objects in caves that are geologically connected to that land, generally belong to the landowner. This was not absolute. It was subject to state law, to the nature of the objects, to whether they met the legal definition of abandoned property, and to whether any other party could establish a competing claim. But the baseline position was in her favor. On second, the trading consortium that had allegedly stored the gold had been legally dissolved in 1894. Its heirs had filed a complaint in 1895 and then abandoned it. Over a century of inaction by any party with a potential claim significantly strengthened her position. Abandoned property, under the relevant statutes, reverted to the landowner after a legally established period. A century and a quarter was by any reasonable interpretation sufficient. Third, the environmental designation on the caves created a procedural requirement, not a prohibition. She would need permits to conduct a formal excavation of the deposits in the upper chamber. Those permits were obtainable. The process would take time and would require professional documentation. But there was no legal basis on which they could be denied if she followed the correct procedures. Fourth, and he said this with particular emphasis, looking at her across the desk with the careful attention of a lawyer who wants to be certain he is understood, she needed to maintain confidentiality. The moment the existence of the potential find became public knowledge, she would face competing interests, regulatory complications, and the attention of parties whose intentions she could not predict. He had seen smaller discoveries become legal battlegrounds that consumed years and fortunes. He strongly advised her to complete the permit process, conduct the formal assessment, and establish legal clarity before speaking to anyone outside the group of professionals she had already consulted, nor all of whom he noted approvingly were bound by professional confidentiality. Elena told him about her family, about Marisol and Hector, about the conversations she had already had. He nodded. He said that family members were a different category from the public, but that the advice was the same. Say nothing until you know what you have. She drove home that evening as the sun set over the coastal scrub, painting the sky in colors that seemed, under the circumstances, almost absurdly dramatic. She thought about the number in her notebook. She thought about Matteo's medical debt and Luke's school clothes and the apartment back in the city, with its humming refrigerator and its drying rack that she had never put away. She thought about Marco, who had left, and about the years since, which had been defined primarily by the arithmetic of survival. She thought about all the things she had told herself she could not afford. Not the material things, but the other things, the slower things, the ones that cost time and attention, and the particular courage of allowing yourself to want something when wanting has historically led nowhere good. She did not let herself cry. Not yet. There would be time for that. The permit process took 11 weeks. Elena had expected it to take longer. She had prepared herself for 6 months of waiting, for regulatory delays and bureaucratic inertia, for the particular torture of knowing something and being unable to act on it. The conservation specialist she hired was a woman named Rosa Iniguez, who had spent 20 years working with environmental agencies and knew the permit system with the intimate fluency of someone who had both designed and dismantled its frustrations, navigated the process with a speed that surprised even Elena. Rosa knew which offices to contact first, which documentation to prepare proactively, which language to use in the applications to signal competence and seriousness. She treated each regulatory step not as an obstacle, but as a procedure. And procedures, she told Elena, could be completed efficiently if you understood them well enough. During those 11 weeks, Elena went back to the city with the boys. She could not afford to rent the cottage indefinitely, and the boys needed their school and their friends and the stability of familiar surroundings. And she arranged with Marcus Chen to handle the permit correspondence on her behalf. She arranged with Rosa Iniguez to manage the technical aspects of the applications. She set up a dedicated email account for all communications related to the project, and she checked it every morning before the boys were awake and every evening after they were asleep. She kept her regular life. She worked her regular job, 3 days a week doing bookkeeping for a small medical practice, the same job she had held for 6 years. She made dinner. She helped with homework. She drove Matteo to his physical therapy appointments and sat in the waiting room reading the same magazines she had read a dozen times before. She called her mother on Sundays. She met Marisol for coffee twice, and both times Marisol asked whether she had sold the cliffs yet. And both times Elena said she was still working through the legal details, and both times Marisol accepted this with the mildly impatient patience of someone who is trying not to be controlling. She did not tell Marisol about the number. She did not tell Hector. She did not tell her mother, or anyone at work, or Mrs. Okonkwo, or any of the friends she still spoke to occasionally. She held the number inside her, the way you hold a breath underwater, with a discipline that has a physical quality to it, a kind of compression. There were moments when the discipline failed her, or nearly failed her. Once, standing in line at the grocery store with a carefully calculated basket of items, she looked at the total on the screen and thought about the number, and had to press her fingernails into her palm to keep her expression from doing something involuntary. Once, reading Luke a bedtime story, she looked at his face in the lamplight and felt the full weight of what might be coming, and had to set the book down and hold him for a moment longer than the story required, pressing her face into his hair. He asked if she was okay, and she said yes. She was just happy to be home. The permits came through on a Wednesday in March. Rosa Iniguez called with the news, and Elena was at the kitchen sink when she heard, rinsing the same coffee mug she had rinsed every morning for years. And the symmetry of that moment, the precise echo of the Tuesday 11 weeks ago when everything had begun, struck her with a force that made her grip the edge of the sink, She thanked Rosa. She hung up, and she stood at the sink for 1 full minute. Then she called Marcus Chen, and then Rosa again, and then the specialist Rosa had recommended for the excavation itself, a man named Jorge Villanueva, who ran a small firm that specialized in exactly this kind of work, the careful, methodical removal of calcite deposits from cave walls with the precision of people who understood that what lay beneath them might be irreplaceable. Jorge had read Dr. Solano's report. He had reviewed the permit conditions. He had sent 2 of his team members to inspect the upper chamber the previous month as part of the permit application process. He was ready when she was. Elena arranged for the boys to stay with her mother for 2 weeks. She drove south again on a Saturday, arriving at the cottage in the early afternoon, and stood for a moment outside it, breathing the salt air, feeling the wind against her face. The cliffs were visible from the road, dark and enormous against the spring sky, the sea below them throwing white spray against the rock in long, lazy arcs. The excavation began on Monday. Jorge's team was 4 people, including himself. They were quiet and methodical, carrying their equipment down the cliff path with the care of people who understood the stakes of what they were doing. Elena descended with them on the first day, standing to one side of the upper chamber, while Jorge briefed his team on the conditions, on the permit requirements, on the protocols for documenting everything they found before touching it. The air in the upper chamber was exactly as Elena remembered it, still and mineral and held. It's the kind of air that belongs to a place that has been sealed from time. The calcite removal was slow. It was the kind of work that could not be hurried without risking damage, and Jorge's team did not hurry. They worked with small tools, with compressed air, with the patient incrementalism of people who understood that the difference between discovery and destruction was the speed at which you approached a thing. Elena came each day and watched and said very little. She had developed, over the past 3 months, a relationship with silence that she had not previously known she was capable of. She understood now why Cecilia had never spoken of what she suspected. Some things could only be held quietly. On the 4th day, the first shape emerged from the calcite. Jorge's team member, a woman named Claudia, who handled the most delicate work, called Elena over in a voice that was carefully controlled and pointed her flashlight at a section of the wall where the white mineral deposit had been partially cleared. Beneath it, a rectangular surface of dark material was visible. Claudia ran a gloved finger along its edge, and the edge was sharp and deliberate and unmistakably manufactured. Elena leaned in close. She could see the surface clearly now. It was not stone. It was not wood. It was metal, dark with age, and with the particular oxidation of a surface that has been enclosed and humidity exposed for a very long time, but metal without question. Its surface bore the faint impression of a stamped mark, partially obscured, but visible as a circular design with text around its edge. Elena straightened. She looked at Jorge. He looked back at her, and his professional composure was intact, but something moved behind his eyes, something that Elena recognized because she had felt it herself in this chamber, in this same spot, on the day she had first pressed her palm against the calcite and understood. "Keep going," she said. They kept going. Over the following 3 days, the calcite was cleared from the entire section of the far wall. What emerged, as the white mineral deposit was carefully removed piece by piece, was a stack of rectangular ingots. They were approximately the size of a large hardback book, each one, and they were stacked in a rough formation that filled a natural alcove in the cave wall, an alcove that had been further shaped by human hands, the walls smoothed and widened and deepened to accommodate the storage. Or the ingots were dark with oxidation on their exposed surfaces, but where Claudia's tools touched them, The metal beneath was the unmistakable warm yellow of refined gold. There were, when the count was finally complete, 247 ingots. Elena stood in the upper chamber on the 7th day of the excavation and looked at them. 247 bars of gold bullion, stacked in an alcove in a sea cave at the base of a cliff on a piece of land that the real estate agent had said was worth $18,000 on a generous day, that her brother had laughed about, that Marisol had told her not to get attached to, that 2 separate agents had described as a liability. Jorge Villanueva stood beside her. He was a man of moderate expressions, but his expression now was not moderate. His expression was the one that people have when they are in the presence of something that exceeds the available vocabulary. "We'll need the appraiser," he said. "I know," Elena said. She pulled her phone from her pocket and stepped toward the cave entrance where the signal was stronger, and she called the number she had saved 3 months ago. The appraiser Marcus Chen had connected her with, a man named William Hargrove, who specialized in precious metals and historical assets, and who had been briefed, under the terms of a non-disclosure agreement Elena had insisted upon, on the general nature of what might be found. William Hargrove arrived 2 days later. He was a tall man in his late 50s, with the particular unhurried quality of someone for whom the unusual has become ordinary through long exposure. He descended the cliff path with a case of instruments and a small team of his own. He spent 2 full days in the upper chamber, working with the methodical attention of his profession. He weighed samples, tested purity, examined the stamped markings on the ingots, cross-referenced them with his historical records, and documented everything with a photographic thoroughness that left no detail unrecorded. Elena waited each evening at the cottage. She cooked simple meals she barely tasted. She called the boys at her mother's house and listened to their voices with the heightened attention of someone who knows that ordinary moments are actually the extraordinary ones, that the sound of an 8-year-old boy describing a dream he had is one of the most valuable things in the world. So she slept in short intervals and woke in the dark with the number cycling through her mind. On the 3rd day, William Hargrove came to the cottage in the evening. He sat at the kitchen table and opened his case and laid out his documentation with the systematic organization of a man presenting evidence. He explained his methodology. He explained the purity assessment, the weight measurements, the historical provenance established by the stamped markings, which he had been able to trace through his reference records to a San Francisco refinery that had operated between 1881 and 1901 and had produced bullion for several major commercial entities, including, he confirmed, the trading consortium named in the Arthur Reyes account and the 1895 legal filing. Then he told her the number. He gave it to her in current market terms, at the spot price for gold as of that morning, adjusted for the historical purity grade of the ingots and the weight of the total find. He also noted that several of the ingots bore additional numismatic interest as historical artifacts, which could, if she chose to sell them through specialized channels rather than at straight bullion value, substantially increase the total. The base value, he said, was $312 million. The upper range, accounting for the numismatic value of the historically significant pieces, was approximately $340 million. He suggested, for planning purposes, that she work with a figure of $305 million as a conservative and defensible midpoint. He closed his case. He looked at her across the kitchen table. Elena looked back at him. The lamp on the table between them cast a warm circle of light. Outside, the ocean was doing what it always did, moving and sounding against the rock, enormous and indifferent and ancient. She had known. She had known since the day she pressed her palm against the calcite and felt the edge beneath it. She had known since the number first appeared in her notebook, written in her own handwriting, looking back at her from the page. She had been carrying the knowledge for months, with the discipline of a woman who had learned not to celebrate things before they were real, because she had been disappointed before, because she could not afford to be wrong. It was real. $305 million. She pressed her hands flat on the table. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of how steady it was. Dr. William Hargrove nodded. He said he would have his formal report to her by the end of the following week. He reminded her, gently, that she should coordinate with Marcus Chen on the disclosure process, as there would be regulatory notifications required before any sale could proceed. He said that she had conducted herself with exceptional care, and that the documentation assembled over the past months was among the most thorough he had seen in cases of this nature. He said, gathering his case, that he hoped it would change her life for the better. "It already has," Elena said. He left. She sat at the table alone in the lamplight. For a very long time, she sat there and let the reality assemble itself around her, not in a rush, not with drama, but slowly, the way light fills a room when you open a door to the morning. She thought about the years. She thought about the apartment and the drying rack and the overdue notices in the mailbox. She thought about Marco leaving and the medical debt and the careful arithmetic of every grocery trip. She thought about Matteo's face when she told him they couldn't do something they both wanted to do, and the particular quiet that fell between them in those moments, and how she had carried that quiet like a stone. She thought about Cecilia. She thought about an old woman who had acquired a piece of clifftop land and held it, without explanation and without yield, for decades, who had commissioned surveys and filed permit inquiries and told no one what she suspected, or perhaps what she knew, who had died at 89 and left everything to a great niece she had met twice, a choice that had seemed, to everyone who knew about it, like eccentricity at best, and at worst, like the final act of a life that had always operated slightly outside the comprehension of others. Cecilia had known. Elena was certain. And Cecilia had chosen her. Not randomly, not as a default of inheritance, but with intention. Because Cecilia, who had held a secret for decades, had recognized in this particular great niece something she trusted. The capacity to wait, the capacity to hold, the capacity to pursue a thing quietly, without applause, through ridicule and discouragement, until it was ready to be known. Elena stood up from the table and walked outside. The night air was cold and full of stars, enormous stars the way they only appear far from city light, and the sound of the ocean was everywhere. She walked to the edge of the property, to where the road ended and the scrub began, and she stood in the dark and breathed. She did not shout. She did not collapse. She did not do any of the things that people in stories do at the moment of great reversal. She simply stood in the dark and let the wind move through her, and she felt, for the first time in a very long time, that she was not alone in a room she could not afford, with a problem she could not solve. She felt, instead, like a woman standing at the beginning of something, with the ground solid beneath her feet, and the horizon open ahead, and all the time in the world. She went inside and called her boys. Matteo answered on the second ring, his voice carrying the slightly suspicious alertness of a 13-year-old who has learned to read the quality of his mother's phone calls. "Mom, are you okay?" "Yes," she said. "I'm okay. I just wanted to hear your voices." Luke came on the line and said he had found a different caterpillar today, a bigger one, and that Grandma had let them stay up until 10, which was clearly a negotiating position rather than a fact. Elena laughed, a real laugh, the kind that starts in the chest and moves upward without any assistance. She talked to them for 20 minutes about caterpillars and chess and Grandma's cooking, and then she said goodnight and told them she would see them soon. She set her phone on the table. She picked up her notebook. She opened it to the page with the number written on it, in her own careful handwriting, underlined real. She looked at it for a long time. Then she turned to a fresh page and began to write the list of things she needed to do next. It was a different kind of list from all the lists she had made before. It was not a list of debts to address, or problems to solve, or obstacles to navigate. It was a list of possibilities. And it was, she realized, as the pen moved across the page, a very long list. Outside, the ocean moved against the rock. The stars burned in the enormous coastal dark. And the cliffs stood as they had always stood, indifferent and ancient, and full of the secret that a woman named Cecilia had kept for decades and bequeathed, along with everything else she had, to the one person she believed was ready to bear it. The disclosure, when it came, did not come the way Elena had imagined it in the abstract. She had imagined a press conference of some kind, or perhaps a formal announcement through the county offices, something with a defined moment, a clear before and after. What actually happened was quieter, less dramatic in its mechanics, and more devastating in its effects, the way most things of genuine consequence tend to be. Marcus Chen filed the required regulatory notifications on a Thursday morning. By Thursday afternoon, a clerk in the county assessor's office had seen the filing. By Thursday evening, someone had made a phone call. By Friday morning, a reporter from the regional newspaper had left a voicemail on Elena's phone that she listened to 3 times, trying to gauge from the woman's careful, professionally neutral tone how much she already knew. She knew enough. Elena called Marcus, and they spoke for 40 minutes. He had expected this. He had told her, in their very first meeting, that disclosure would create complications. And he had spent the intervening months helping her build a legal and documentary foundation solid enough to withstand whatever came next. The papers were in order. The permits were valid. The appraisal was documented. The provenance was established. The property ownership was unambiguous. She was, in every legal sense that mattered, on ground that could not easily be shaken. He advised her to say nothing to the press until they had prepared a brief formal statement. He advised her to let him handle all inquiries until the statement was ready. He advised her, in his unhurried and solid way, to take a breath. She took the breath. The statement went out on Monday. It was 3 paragraphs. It confirmed that a significant historical find had been made in the cave system beneath a privately owned coastal property, that the find had been made in accordance with all applicable environmental and regulatory requirements, that the relevant authorities had been notified as required by law, and that the matter was being handled through appropriate legal channels. It thanked the professionals whose expertise had made the process possible. It said nothing about the number. The number leaked anyway. Elena did not know how. She suspected William Hargrove's documentation, which had passed through several official offices as part of the regulatory notification process. She suspected the county clerk. She suspected the particular way that significant numbers, once written down and filed, acquire a kind of gravitational pull that draws eyes toward them, regardless of the confidentiality of the container. However it happened, by Tuesday the figure had appeared in the regional newspaper, and by Wednesday it had been picked up by 2 national outlets, and by Thursday Elena's phone had received 412 messages, of which she read 11 before handing the device to Marcus Chen and asking him to manage communications until further notice. She drove to her mother's house and collected the boys. Her mother, Elena Vasquez, was a small woman with strong hands and the particular calm of someone who has raised children through difficulty and emerged from the experience with an unshakable relationship to what actually matters. She had seen the news on her tablet Wednesday morning. She had not called Elena. She had simply made a rose con leche and waited. When Elena arrived, Rosa opened the door, looked at her daughter for a long moment, and then pulled her into an embrace that lasted longer than any embrace Elena could remember from recent years. You did good, Rosa said into her hair. Elena held on. She did not cry. She was still not ready to cry, still not ready to let the discipline she had maintained for 4 months release, because she was afraid that if it released, she would not be able to stop. She held on to her mother in the doorway of the small house where she had grown up, and breathed the familiar smell of coffee and clean laundry and arroz con leche, and felt for the first time that she was allowed to be tired. The boys had seen it too. Matteo had been awake when the national story broke. He had come downstairs at 6 in the morning and found his grandmother at the kitchen table with her tablet, and he had read the headline over her shoulder. And then he had gone very still, in the way that 13-year-olds go still when something exceeds their existing categories of experience. When Elena walked in the door, he looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not quite awe, not quite fear, something between the two. The expression of a boy who is discovering that his mother has been carrying something extraordinary in silence. "Mom," he said. "I know," she said. "Did you know the whole time?" "Not the whole time," she said. "But for a while, yes." He processed this. He looked at her with the particular intensity of a teenager recalibrating. "Why didn't you tell us?" She sat down at the kitchen table, and she told him the truth. The real truth, not a softened version. She told him that she had not told anyone because she had been afraid. Afraid of being wrong, afraid of raising hopes that might collapse, afraid of what it would mean if she was right, and then something went wrong anyway. She told him that she had learned, in the years since his father left, that certain things needed to be protected while they were still fragile, needed to be held close and tended quietly before they were ready to bear the weight of other people's attention. Matteo listened. He nodded once, slowly, with a seriousness that made him look, for a moment, older than he was. Luke, who was 8, and had absorbed the news with the baffling adaptability of young children, climbed into Elena's lap and announced that he wanted a dog. She laughed. It was the same real laugh she had laughed when she called them from the cottage, starting in the chest and moving upward, while she held Luke against her with one arm and reached across the table and gripped Matteo's hand with the other. And she sat like that at her mother's kitchen table, while the arroz con leche cooled on the stove, and the world outside began to change. Marisol called that afternoon. Elena had been expecting this call with more anxiety than she wanted to admit. Marisol was not a difficult person. She was a good person, warm and loyal, and Elena loved her genuinely. But the conversations they had had, the gentle dismissals, the practical advice, the don't get attached, had lodged somewhere tender, and Elena had been uncertain how it would feel to hear her cousin's voice now. Marisol's voice when she called was not what Elena expected. It was quiet, stripped of its usual efficient energy. She said Elena's name once, and then she was silent for a moment. And when she spoke again, her voice had a quality in it that Elena had never heard before, a kind of humbled wonder that sat strangely on someone who was generally so certain of things. "I told you not to get attached," Marisol said. "I know," Elena said. "I told you it was worthless cliffs." "You did." A pause. "Elena, I am so sorry." Elena had expected to feel something complicated at this. She had expected some mixture of vindication and discomfort, the bittersweet alloy of being right when someone you love was wrong. What she felt instead was simpler. She felt forgiveness, immediate and complete, the way you feel forgiveness when someone speaks with genuine humility and without excuse. Marisol was not making excuses. She was simply saying she had been wrong. "So you were trying to protect me," Elena said. "You always try to protect me." "I didn't believe in you," Marisol said, and her voice caught slightly on the last word. "I should have." "You didn't know," Elena said. Nobody knew. I barely knew. They talked for an hour. It was one of the better conversations Elena could remember having with Marisol in years. Better than the careful conversations over coffee, where Marisol's practicality and Elena's precarious circumstances created an invisible distance between them neither of them acknowledged. This conversation had no distance. It was simply two women who loved each other, talking. Hector's call was different. Hector called the next morning. When Elena answered, he was quiet for so long that she thought the connection had dropped. "Hector," she said. "I told you to sell the cliffs," he said. "You did." "I said it was $18,000 of nothing." "You did." Another silence. Then, "Elena." His voice had something in it she had not heard since they were children, a kind of stripped-down softness that his adult personality had layered over with humor and practicality and bluntness. "I have been sitting here since Wednesday trying to figure out what to say to you, and I cannot find the words." "You don't need words," she said. "I laughed," he said. "When you told me." "I laughed." "Yes. I told you to come home. I told you it wasn't worth your time." "Hector." "I'm your brother, and I told you it was worthless." "Hector." Her voice was firm but gentle. "You told me the truth as you understood it. Everyone told me the truth as they understood it. The difference is that I had information you didn't have, and I couldn't share it yet. That's not your fault." He was quiet again. When he spoke, the stripped-down softness was still there. "You're not angry." "No," she said. And it was true. She had examined the question of anger carefully in the days since the disclosure, turned it over the way you turn over a stone to see what lies beneath it, and she had found that there was nothing there. No resentment, no accumulated grievance seeking its moment of release. What she had found instead was something that surprised her, a kind of gratitude, not for the dismissal itself, but for the way it had shaped her. The mockery and the dismissal had required her to move quietly, to build her case methodically, to seek expert guidance at every step, to proceed without the kind of premature excitement that causes people to rush and make mistakes. The disbelief of the people around her had, in a way she had not expected, protected the discovery. It had kept her careful. "Come for dinner," she told Hector. "Bring the kids. Mom is making arroz con leche, and there is enough for everyone." He came. He brought his wife and his two boys, and his particular brand of loud affection that had always filled whatever room he entered, and he hugged Elena at the door for a long time without speaking. And then he went into the kitchen and was immediately the loudest person in it. And the evening was warm and crowded and full of the particular noise of a family that has come through something together and is still mostly intact on the other side. In the weeks that followed, the public attention was both more and less than Elena had anticipated. More in the sense that the story spread further and faster than she had expected, appearing in national publications, in international outlets, in the kind of media coverage that a discovery of this nature, a widow, a worthless inheritance, $300 million in gold, attracted with the inevitability of a story that contains every element the human appetite for reversal has always craved. Less in the sense that the coverage was, by and large, accurate. Marcus Chen had done his work well. The documentation was impeccable. There were no competing claims that held legal water. The regulatory process had been followed correctly. There was nothing for anyone to contest. Several parties tried anyway. A law firm representing what it described as a descendants collective, the alleged heirs of the trading consortium's primary operator, filed a claim asserting historical ownership of the gold. Marcus dismissed it in 3 pages. The trading consortium had been legally dissolved in 1894. Its heirs had filed a complaint in 1895 and abandoned it. Over a century of documented inaction, combined with the property rights established by Cecilia's original purchase and Elena's valid inheritance, rendered the claim legally untenable. The firm withdrew it within 6 weeks. A state regulatory body raised a question about whether the gold qualified as a cultural or historical artifact, requiring state oversight of its disposition. Marcus engaged a cultural property specialist who produced a detailed assessment, concluding that while the find had historical significance, it did not meet the statutory definition of a cultural artifact under the applicable law, and that the property rights of the landowner were therefore not superseded. The question was resolved in 10 weeks. There was a period of 2 months during which Elena did nothing but wait. She had become, through no particular desire of her own, briefly famous, the kind of fame that attaches itself to the pivot point of a compelling story and burns bright for a season before dimming. She declined most interview requests. She gave one brief interview to a journalist she trusted, a woman who had covered the story with accuracy and restraint from the beginning, and in that interview, she said the things she wanted to say. She said that the find had been the result of careful work by dedicated professionals. She said that the history of the caves deserved to be understood and respected. She said that she was grateful to the town that had been, in its way, a temporary home. She said, when pressed about what she planned to do with the money, that she had a list, and it was a long one. She did not mention Cecilia. That was private. That was between her and a woman she had barely known, and now knew, in some way she could not fully explain, profoundly. The sale of the gold was handled through William Hargrove's firm, working in coordination with Marcus Chen and a financial advisor named Sandra Park, who was referred to Elena through the kind of careful chain of professional recommendation that characterized everything about the way this process had unfolded. The historically significant ingots were sold through a specialized auction house. The remainder were sold at bullion value through established commercial channels. The process took 4 months. The total realized was $308 million, slightly above William Hargrove's midpoint estimate. After taxes, legal fees, professional fees, regulatory costs, and all other expenses of the discovery and sale process, the net amount deposited into Elena Vasquez's account was $219 million. She sat with Sandra Park in a quiet office the day the final transfer cleared, looking at the account balance on a screen, and she felt the full strangeness of it, the particular vertigo of a number that does not fit in the existing architecture of your life and requires you to rebuild the architecture entirely. Sandra asked if she was all right. Elena said yes. She asked for a glass of water. The first thing she did, the very first, was pay Matteo's medical debt. Not because it was the largest financial problem, it was not, but because it was the one that had accumulated while he was sick and frightened, and she had sat in waiting rooms reading the same magazines and been unable to do anything about the numbers growing in the background. She paid it in full, to the penny, and then she asked the hospital's billing office to send her a final paid statement, which she kept. The second thing she did was call her mother. She told Rosa that she was buying her a house. Rosa protested. Elena said the protest was noted and overruled. They drove together to look at properties on a Saturday, the two of them and the boys, and Rosa found a house with a garden, a real garden with raised beds and enough sun for tomatoes, and Elena bought it in cash on a Monday and handed her mother the keys on a Tuesday, and watched Rosa stand in the middle of her new garden with her strong hands at her sides and look around at the space with an expression that made Elena's discipline finally fail. She cried in her car for 10 minutes, then she dried her face and went back inside. Matteo's future was secured in a trust that Sandra Park helped her structure, an educational fund that would cover whatever path he chose, university or trade or art or something that did not yet have a name, with enough remaining to give him a foundation when he reached adulthood. Luke's was identical. Elena sat with the legal documents for both trusts and read every page, and signed with a steadiness that felt like the most important thing she had ever signed. She paid off the apartment. Then she found a different one, larger, in a neighborhood with better schools, and a park within walking distance, and she moved the boys into it on a Saturday, with the help of professional movers and her brother Hector, who showed up with his 2 boys and his loud affection, and carried boxes with an enthusiasm that she suspected was partly penance and mostly love. She hired 3 people at the medical practice where she had been doing bookkeeping, not because anyone had asked her to, because the practice was struggling, and Dr. Moorhead, who had employed her for 6 years with patience and fairness when other employers might not have, deserved better. She structured it as an anonymous donation to the practice's operational fund, which Sandra Park helped her execute, and she never mentioned it to Dr. Moorhead, who announced to the staff 3 weeks later that they would be able to hire support staff for the first time in 4 years, and who cried briefly at the staff meeting, which Elena witnessed with entirely neutral professional composure. She went back to the harbor town. She had been thinking about this return for months, through all the legal proceedings and the press coverage and the financial structuring. She had been thinking about June, the librarian, and the photocopied Historical Society newsletter that had changed everything. She had been thinking about the town's small library with its peeling white paint and its bake sale budget. She had been thinking about Arthur Reyes, who had spent 2 decades documenting the harbor's history and published it in a newsletter that most people had never read. She made 2 things happen. The first was a donation to the harbor town's public library, sufficient to renovate the building, expand the collection, establish a dedicated local history archive, and fund the library's operations for 30 years. Now she asked only that the archive be named for Arthur Reyes, who had found the story when no one else was looking. The second was a conversation with the County Historical Society about the caves themselves. Elena had spoken with environmental specialists about this at length. The gold was gone, sold and dispersed, and transformed into the things it needed to become. But the caves remained. The upper chamber, the passages, the natural architecture of basalt and time still existed, still held the history of what had happened there, still carried the particular quality of a place where human events had left their mark on geological time. She worked with the Historical Society and the County Environmental Office to establish the Southern Cave System as a protected historical and natural site, accessible by guided tours for educational purposes, with a small interpretive installation near the entrance that told the story of the harbor's trading history and the winter of 1893. She attended the opening of the interpretive installation on a Saturday in November, standing at the back of a small crowd that included June and several members of the Historical Society, and a scattering of local residents, and a journalist or 2 who had tracked the story through to this quieter conclusion. The curator gave a brief speech. The installation was unveiled, a series of panels with historical photographs and text, ending with the account of the discovery and a photograph of the upper chamber's alcove, now empty, its calcite cleared away, the rock beneath it bare and ordinary. And Elena stood at the back and looked at the photograph for a long time. There was a moment during the ceremony when June appeared at her side, smaller and older and sharper-eyed than ever, and placed a hand on Elena's arm. She did not say anything. She simply stood beside her for a moment, and then she squeezed Elena's arm once and moved away, and Elena understood that this was, from June, everything. The real estate agent who had sent her the apologetic email about the property's limited appeal called, some weeks after the story had broken, to offer his congratulations and, she suspected, to see whether there was any future business to be had. Elena thanked him politely. She had, in the end, No use for apologies from people who had simply told her the truth as they understood it. The agent had been right about everything he could see. He had not been able to see what Cecilia had seen, what Elena had been patient enough to find. She did not resent him. She did not resent any of them. What she felt, in the months that followed the settlement of everything, was something she needed new language to describe. It was not triumph, exactly, though there was an element of that. Warm and earned. It was not relief, though there was that too. The profound, cellular relief of a woman released from the specific exhaustion of financial precarity that had been her companion for years. It was something that encompassed both of those things, and also something beyond them, a feeling of alignment, of having moved through difficulty with her character intact, of having been offered a thing and been equal to the receiving of it. She thought often about Cecilia when she commissioned a small historical research project through the local university, asking them to document Cecilia's life as fully as possible from available records. What they found was fragmentary, but coherent. Cecilia had been a reader, a traveler, a woman of fierce intelligence and limited means who had spent her life in the harbor town after inheriting the clifftop land from an uncle who had purchased it cheaply in the 1950s. She had been a familiar figure at the library. She had read widely in local history. She had, the records suggested, encountered the Arthur Reyes article not long after it was published in 1987, and had spent the following years quietly assembling her understanding of what lay beneath her land. She had never had the resources to pursue it fully. The permit application 12 years before her death had been her closest attempt, an attempt that had been returned without action because she had not been able to provide the detailed geological documentation the environmental office required. She had been old by then. She had not had the energy or the money to take it further. But she had kept the land, and she had given it to Elena. The university research team included in their final report a single note that Elena read 3 times, sitting at her kitchen table in the new apartment, with the morning light coming through windows that were large enough to deserve the word. A neighbor in the harbor town, an elderly woman who had known Cecilia in the last decade of her life, had reported that Cecilia had spoken of Elena occasionally. She had described her as a young woman who had the right kind of patience, who understood that some things could not be hurried, who would know what to do when the time came. Elena set the report on the table. She sat with her hands in her lap in the morning light. She thought about patience, about the particular kind of patience that is not passive, not the patience of waiting and hoping and doing nothing, but the active, deliberate patience of a person who keeps moving, keeps working, keeps building the case, keeps descending into the cave even when everyone above is laughing, because they understand that the truth does not care about the timeline of the people seeking it. The truth simply waits, as the gold had waited in the calcite dark of the upper chamber, as Cecilia had waited with her permit application and her library books and her fierce, quiet intelligence for someone with the right kind of patience to come along. Elena thought about the apartment she had stood in 11 months ago at the kitchen sink, watching water circle the drain. She thought about the letter. She thought about the drive south and the salt wind and the cliffs opening before her at the end of the path in a way that photographs could not prepare a person for. She thought about pressing her palm flat against the calcite wall in the dark of the upper chamber and feeling the edge beneath it, hard and deliberate and unmistakably real. She thought about the morning she had stood outside the cottage in the dark, with the stars enormous above her and the ocean moving against the rock and the number written in her notebook, and she had felt, for the first time, like a woman standing at the beginning of something. She was still at the beginning. That was the thing she had come to understand, sitting in the morning light in her new apartment, with the university report on the table, and the boys asleep in their rooms, and her mother's garden 2 miles away, already planted with the first of the spring tomatoes. The discovery had not ended anything. It had not solved her, or completed her, or resolved her into a simpler version of herself. What it had done was remove the constraints that had been narrowing her world for years, and in removing them, it had expanded everything. It opened the space in which she now lived to a size she was still learning to inhabit. She picked up her notebook, not the same one from the cottage. That one was in a box of things she kept. A new one, plain covered, purchased at the pharmacy around the corner. She opened it to the first page. She wrote at the top, "What I want to do next." She sat for a moment, thinking. Then she began to write. She wrote about the scholarship fund she wanted to establish for students from single-parent households in financial need, because she knew what it was to be young and capable and constrained by money. She wrote about the coastal conservation work she wanted to support, because the caves had shown her that the places that look worthless from a distance often hold what the world cannot afford to lose. She wrote about learning to sail, which she had wanted to do since she was 12 years old and had never been able to afford. She wrote about taking the boys to see Cecilia's harbor town in the summer, properly this time, without the urgency of a discovery pressing at her from the inside, just to walk the streets and look at the library and stand at the top of the cliffs and let the wind press against them all and know that the sea below was simply beautiful. She wrote for a long time. The boys woke and came to the kitchen. Matteo first, with the slightly dazed expression of a teenager whose body requires more sleep than any schedule can provide. And then Luke, who arrived at the table with his hair in several directions at once and announced with great certainty that he wanted pancakes. Elena closed the notebook. She stood and went to the cabinet and found the flour and the baking powder and the milk, and she made pancakes in the new kitchen with its large windows and its morning light. And she listened to her sons argue cheerfully about something she didn't fully follow, and she stood at the stove with the spatula in her hand and felt the particular fullness of an ordinary morning that has been earned. It was, she understood, the real treasure. Not the gold, which was real and had done real good, and would continue to do real good for years in the forms she was giving it. But this, the morning, the pancakes, the argument about nothing, the light through the windows, the notebook on the table with the long list of what she wanted to do next, the knowledge that when she finished making breakfast, she would have the day, and the day after that, and all the days that followed, to find out what she was capable of when the constraints were gone and the space was open and the horizon stretched ahead as far as she could see. The cliffs were still there, 5 hours south, rising from the water in their dark shelves of basalt, the seagrass bending in the wind on their tops, the cave entrances below them open now with their interpretive panels and their guided tours and their name on the register of protected historical sites. The gold was gone from the upper chamber, but the chamber remained, its calcite-cleared walls bare and honest, its alcove empty and unashamed. And somewhere in the harbor town, in the renovated library with its new local history archive, the photocopied pages of Arthur Reyes's 1987 newsletter sat in an acid-free folder in a climate-controlled cabinet, properly preserved for the first time, available to anyone who came looking. Some things needed only to be found by the right person. Elena flipped the pancakes. Luke reached across the table and stole a piece of Matteo's toast, and Matteo said his name with the specific outrage of a brother who has been provoked, and Elena said both their names with the specific neutralities of a mother who has been mediating this particular conflict since one of them was old enough to reach the other's plate. She was smiling when she said it. She was still smiling when she brought the pancakes to the table and sat down with her sons in the morning light of the life she had found on the other side of the cliffs, the life that had been waiting, patient and certain and full, for her to come and claim it. The scholarship fund was the thing that surprised her most. She had written it down in the notebook as an intention, one item among many on a list that had continued growing in the weeks after that first morning. She had imagined something modest, a few annual awards to deserving students, administered quietly through an established foundation. What she had not imagined was the letter. It arrived 4 months after she established the fund, forwarded through the foundation's administrator from a girl named Daniela, who was 17 years old and lived in the same city Elena had grown up in, 3 neighborhoods over from the apartment where Elena had stood at the kitchen sink. Daniela had written the letter by hand, in careful cursive on lined paper torn from a school notebook, and she had written it not to thank Elena, but to ask her something. She had read about the fund in a school counselor's office, she said. She had read the eligibility criteria, which included students from single-parent households, students with financial need, students whose circumstances had interrupted or threatened their education. She met every criterion. She had not applied because she did not believe that things like this applied to people like her. She was writing, she said, not to apply, but to ask whether Elena thought it was real, whether the money was real, whether a person like Daniela, who had never had a thing given to her without a cost attached, was actually allowed to receive something like this without conditions she couldn't see yet. Elena read the letter twice. Then she picked up the phone and called the foundation administrator and asked for Daniela's contact information. The administrator expressed some hesitation about protocol. Elena said she understood and asked again. The administrator, who was a practical person, provided the number. Elena called Daniela on a Tuesday evening. Daniela answered on the 5th ring, her voice carrying the careful suspicion of a young woman who has learned to be cautious about unexpected calls. Elena introduced herself. There was a silence so complete that Elena could hear Daniela breathing. "You're the cliff lady," Daniela said finally. Elena laughed. "I suppose I am." They talked for 40 minutes. Elena answered Daniela's question directly and without embellishment. Yes, the money was real. Yes, the fund was real. Yes, Daniela was allowed to apply. Yes. Elena believed that things like this applied to people like Daniela, and to people like Elena, and to everyone whose circumstances had made them doubt that the door was ever going to open for them. She told Daniela that she knew what it was to stand at a threshold and not quite believe you were allowed to cross it. She told her that the believing came after the crossing, not before. She told her to apply. Daniela applied. She was awarded a full scholarship that covered 4 years of university, living expenses, and books, with a supplemental stipend for incidentals that Elena had insisted on including because she knew from her own years of financial precarity that it was always the incidentals that undid people. The unexpected bus fare, the broken laptop, the cost of a professional outfit for an internship interview, the small amounts that were large when you didn't have them. Daniela's acceptance letter arrived at the foundation office in March. The administrator forwarded a scan to Elena. Elena printed it and put it in the same folder where she kept Matteo's paid medical statement and the keys to her mother's house and the deed to the clifftop land, which she had decided, after considerable thought, to keep. She would not sell the cliffs. This decision had come to her gradually, the way most of the important decisions in the past year had come, not in a flash, but in increments, each day adding a small weight to one side of the scale until the balance became undeniable. The gold was gone. The cave system was protected. The historical record was established and preserved. But the land itself, the clifftop acreage with its seagrass and its salt wind and its narrow gravel path descending to the water, that was hers. Cecilia had held it for a lifetime and given it to Elena, and Elena understood now that some things are not meant to be converted into money, even by a woman who spent years without enough of it. She arranged, through Rosa Iniguez and the county environmental office, for the land to be maintained as a public access point, the cliff path cleared and safe, a small bench placed at the top where the view was widest, a simple plaque set into the ground near the bench that read, "In memory of Cecilia." She kept the land in her name. She paid the minimal property taxes from an account set aside for the purpose. She planned to take the boys there in the summer and stand at the bench and look at the horizon and say nothing, because there was nothing that needed to be said. It was Matteo who surprised her next. She had been watching him since the disclosure, watching the way the news had settled into him differently than it had settled into Luke, who had adapted with the cheerful pragmatism of an 8-year-old, for whom the main immediate consequence was a dog and better pancakes. Matteo had been quieter, more internal. He had asked questions in the days after, good questions, careful ones, about the legal process and the geological assessment and the historical research. He had borrowed one of the books Elena had bought about 19th century maritime trade, and read it in his room over the course of 2 weeks with a concentration she found when she passed his door and saw him bent over the pages, almost startling. She had not pushed. She had learned, and in 13 years of mothering him, that Matteo processed things at his own speed, and that the most useful thing she could do was remain available and not crowd the process. He came to her one evening in February, when the new apartment had settled into the comfortable familiarity of a place that has been lived in long enough to accumulate its own small history. His own coffee mug on the shelf, Luke's drawings on the refrigerator, the particular way the afternoon light fell through the kitchen windows at 4 o'clock. He came in and sat down at the kitchen table across from her and put his hands flat on the surface in the way she had apparently done so many times that he had absorbed it as a gesture of serious conversation. "I want to study history," he said. Elena looked at him. He was 13, and he had the careful expression of someone who has rehearsed a conversation and is now delivering it, uncertain of the reception. "Okay," she said. He had expected more pushback than that, she could tell. He recalibrated. I want to study it seriously. Not just in school. I want to know how people figure out what happened in the past, how they find things, like what Dr. Alderton did, like what Arthur Reyes did." Elena thought about Arthur Reyes, who had spent 2 decades documenting the harbor's history and published it in a newsletter that most people had never read, whose name was now on an archive in a renovated library because a woman he had never met had found his work at the right moment. "That's called historical research," she said. "I know," Matteo said. "I read about it." Of course he had. "What did you read?" he told her. He had been reading not only the maritime trade book, but articles online, interviews with historians and archaeologists, accounts of significant historical finds, and the research processes that led to them. He had been particularly interested, he said, in the cases where the evidence had been there all along and simply hadn't been read correctly, where the answer was in the record, but no one had assembled the pieces in the right order. He said this with the particular intensity of a 13-year-old who has recognized something of himself in a description, the look of a person who has found their shape in the world. Elena listened to all of it. She asked questions, real questions, for not the encouraging mother questions that move a conversation along, but the actual curious questions of one person interested in what another person is telling them. They talked for an hour and a half. She made tea. Luke came in and was bribed with a cookie to leave them alone for a few more minutes, which bought them approximately 7 minutes before he returned to report that he had finished the cookie. After Matteo went to his room, Elena sat at the kitchen table with her cold tea and thought about the particular way that history moves through families, about Cecilia, who had found the Arthur Reyes article and spent the following years assembling her understanding of what lay beneath her land, about Elena herself, who had stood in a cave and felt the edge of something under her hand, and known, done with the certainty of a person reading a language they didn't know they had learned, what it meant. And about Matteo, who was 13 years old and had borrowed a book about maritime trade and read it in his room with total concentration, and come to his mother with his hands flat on the table to tell her what he wanted to do with his life. Some things move through families not as possessions, but as capacities. The capacity to see, the capacity to wait, the capacity to follow a thread of evidence through mockery and discouragement until it leads somewhere real. She wrote that down in the notebook, not for any particular purpose, just to keep it. Spring arrived in the harbor town the way it always had, indifferent to the events of the previous year. The seagrass on the cliffs greened and thickened, so the water below the basalt shelves shifted from its winter gray to the particular blue of spring light on deep water, saturated and clear. The interpretive installation at the cave entrance gathered its first season of visitors, groups of schoolchildren and weekend tourists, and the occasional historian or journalist who came to stand at the cave mouth and look in at the passages and try to picture a winter night in 1893 when men carried heavy cases down the cliff path in the dark and sealed them behind stone. Elena brought the boys in June, as she had planned. They drove down on a Friday, the three of them, with a bag of food and a change of clothes, and no particular agenda beyond being there. They stopped at the diner where Elena had eaten eggs alone in February of the previous year, and she ordered the same thing, and this time she tasted it. They stopped at the library, which was mid-renovation. The exterior scaffolded, and the interior temporarily moved to a neighboring building. And Elena introduced herself to the temporary librarian, a young man who recognized her name and became slightly flustered, and she asked whether the archive materials were safe, and was assured they were, housed carefully in their climate-controlled cabinet, waiting for the new building to be ready to receive them properly. They drove to the cliffs in the late afternoon. The path was clear, the scrub along its edges freshly cut back, the footing firm. Elena walked it first, and the boys followed, Luke skipping ahead and then coming back, Matteo walking with his hands in his pockets and his eyes moving across the landscape with the attention of someone assembling a picture. The bench at the top had been placed since Elena's last visit, simple wood on a simple frame, the plaque set into the ground in front of it. She stood at the bench and read the plaque, and then looked up at the horizon. The sea stretched out before them to the edge of the visible world. The light on the water was enormous, the afternoon sun breaking into 1,000 separate points across the surface, each one burning briefly and going out and being replaced by another. The wind came off the water in long, steady pushes that pressed their clothing against them and moved through their hair. Below the cliffs, the water broke against the rock in its long, rolling exhalation. Luke stood at the edge of the path and held his arms out to the sides and let the wind push against them. Matteo stood beside the bench and read the plaque. He stood there for a while, reading something that took only 3 seconds to read, which meant he wasn't reading it, but thinking about it, which meant he was doing what he did when things were settling into him. Elena stood beside him and did not say anything. After a while, Matteo said, "She never got to see it." "No," Elena said. "She knew it was there, though." "I think so." He looked at the plaque again. "It seems unfair." Elena considered this carefully. "It would seem that way," she said, "but I think she got something from it anyway. The knowing, the holding on to it. She kept the land for all those years because she believed in it, and that belief was hers, whether anyone else knew about it or not." Matteo thought about this. So the believing was enough even without the finding. For her, it had to be, Elena said. But she made sure someone else would do the finding. That was her version of enough. He nodded, slowly, in the way he nodded when something had settled. They sat on the bench, the three of them, Elena in the middle with one boy on each side, Luke pressing against her shoulder, and Matteo sitting at a 13-year-old's careful distance that was still, she noticed, close enough for their arms to touch. The wind moved around them. The water moved below. The light changed on the horizon in its slow, indifferent way. Elena thought about the year, about the letter, and the drive south, and the caves, and the number in her notebook, and all the careful, quiet work of the months between. She thought about Cecilia on this same clifftop, perhaps on a day like this one, standing with the wind and the sea and the knowledge of what lay below, holding it alone because there was no one to hold it with her. She thought about what it meant to receive something from someone you barely knew, to be trusted with a thing that person spent a lifetime protecting. She thought about the weight of that trust and the responsibility it carried, and the strange, humbling grace of being seen clearly by someone who had very little reason to see you at all. She put her arm around Luke. She felt Matteo's shoulder warm against hers. Below them, the caves were open to whoever came looking. The gold was gone, converted into scholarships and library archives, and a young woman named Daniela, who was going to university in the fall. The cliffs remained, as they had always remained, dark and patient and full of the particular quality of a place that has endured everything and expects to endure more. The bench was warm from the afternoon sun. The horizon was as wide as the world. Elena sat with her sons at the edge of the cliffs that everyone had said were worthless, and she breathed the salt air that had been blowing across this coastline since long before anyone alive had been born to breathe it, and she felt, in the particular way that she had been learning to feel things since the year began, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because the universe had planned it, not because she was lucky, though she had been, in ways she would spend years understanding, but because she had been patient, because she had been careful, because she had driven 5 hours south on a feeling she could not entirely explain, and descended into a cave on a borrowed flashlight, and pressed her palm against a wall in the dark, and trusted what she felt there. Because she had done the work, all of it, the research and the lawyers and the permits and the waiting, and she had done it quietly and without applause and without the approval of the people who loved her most, because the truth did not require their approval to be true. She thought one final time about the kitchen sink, about the water circling the drain, about the flat gray sky and the drying rack and the overdue notices and the grinding arithmetic of a life that had been slowly running out of room. She thought about how different the sky looked from here. She thought about how the same woman who had stood at that sink, why exhausted and diminished and rinsing the same mug for the 1,000th time, had driven south and found something that had been waiting 130 years for the right person to come down the cliff path and put her hand against the wall. She thought about Cecilia, who had believed in her before she believed in herself. She thought about all the things that look worthless from a distance and hold everything up close. The wind came off the water and moved through the seagrass and pressed warm against their faces. Luke tilted his head back and closed his eyes. Matteo looked at the horizon with his historian's attention, already somewhere inside a question the world hadn't asked yet. Elena held them both and looked at the sea and said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. Because the story was not a thing that needed saying anymore, because it was simply, at last, and completely, hers. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.